Talk about being influenced by visual art in the Cubist story. Do you focus on an image and take it out from there? I'm thinking in particular right now of Secessions, where it takes place in a laundromat, and so it feels very visually oriented in that story.
Yeah, so I think that collection in particular, even the stories that were not directly about visual art, were an attempt, conscious or unconscious, I don't know, to deal with image through words. So there's Secession, which is in the laundromat, and then there's cartographies with the maps. Yeah, a lot of them deal with image and the attempt to convey meaning through image and to create movement through image rather than through plot. So that was a really big focus of this first collection. I think that image, the visual element is still really important in my work, but it's not quite as central as it was in this first collection.
Are you very interested in visual art and painting?
Yeah, not quite as much in Seattle. I'm just busy, and the visual art scene isn't as sort of in my face as it was certainly when I was growing up, because both of my parents were visual artists, so every weekend, they would take me to galleries or a museum, and the museums in New York are so fabulous.
New York was where you grew up?
Yes.
So your parents were both artists?
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. So did you grow up, all of your artistic pursuits were encouraged?
Yes. I never had any formal visual art training. Oh, maybe that's not true. Maybe when I was little I took classes at the Y after school, clay or something. So my parents never discouraged me from doing any sort of visual art, but they were so amazing that by the time I was a teenager I did not want to compete in that realm anymore, and I stopped doing anything visual for a long time. But I played the flute. I took, as a little kid, but especially as a teenager, did a lot of modern dance. Those were the main areas when I was growing up, and they took me to movies all the time. They took me to Ingmar Bergman films when I was 12. Some of it was the lack of money and not having a babysitter, but some of it was just like, we're going to the galleries, and then we're going out for Chinese food with our friends, and then we're going to the movies, and you're coming with us. So I was exposed to a lot of art, and to classical music. Not so much in New York City, but in the summers. We spent a lot of summers in Maine, and there was a chamber music sort of school at Kneisel Hall, and I went to tons of concerts there. So I got exposed to a lot of art growing up, of different kinds.
Did you know that you were going to be an artist very early?
I knew I was going to be a writer. Yes, I remember a book that I made when I was probably 4 or 5. It was on black construction paper, and I drew crayon or chalk pictures, and my mother, I dictated some text to my mother, and I think it had like holes punched and it was tied together with yarn or something, the pages. Do not remember what the pictures were of, what the story was, but I have a visual memory of that book. And then when I was in 2nd grade, you get asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And writer was one of those things.
Did you read a lot as a kid?
Oh, yeah. Tons.
Do you have any favorite books from that period?
Yes. Little House on the Prairie, that whole series. That was really big for me. And I'm currently starting to work on an essay about why and the influence that had on me. And then there was funny story. There was a book that I loved, which I thought was called Beneath the Pawpaw Trees. I just had this memory of loving it. I didn't remember what it was about or anything, and I couldn't find it for years, and it's just been reissued, and I reread it, and it wasn't that great. But on the other hand, since having kids, there have been times when I'll rediscover a kid's book that there's one called The Umbrella, I believe, that I had totally forgotten about, and I'll see it again, and the amazement of that book and the feeling of reading it are just, it's as if 40 years never passed.
Your kids enjoy reading, is it also?
You cannot get my daughter's nose out of a book. It is impossible. Her brother yells at her at every meal to put the book down. He loves to read too, but not quite as much.
Another aspect that I noticed in many of these stories, two things I want to talk about, is in that story Cartography is about how the body and natural land are merged and used off of each other, and also an element of tragedy that comes up what is otherwise non-tense story. For example, I think it's in Voices from the Blue Hotel, In the first story, the house had many rooms where the children's perspective, am I right? And at the end, it seems like they are responsible for burning the house down. And yet, the whole thing has such a tone of levity in a way because the kids and all the things that go on. And then at the end, something quite serious does seem to have come of it.
I don't think that's conscious. I mean, I think part of me has a very dark view of the world, and that must just come through. I'm glad that works, that there's a tension between tone and content in that way, but that isn't one of the things that I consciously set out to do.
In that story, I think it's called Ashes, where there's a divorce and impending doom from a volcano, and the kid is like obsessed with volcanic images.
Right.
Really beautiful line where she clicked like a Geiger counter, and which again brings the relation between the natural world sort of with the body. Is that something that you do consciously?
No. I mean, I think I'm always thinking about metaphor, but not a conscious choice to make those particular types of metaphors, as an ongoing project in some way.
Do you have a story completely figured out when you start writing it?
No, but pretty early on, I have a sense of what I want it to be about, what I want it to focus on, what I think of it as its heart. So that comes pretty early on. Maybe sometimes before words go on the page, but definitely before a first draft of any kind is completed. And if I can't figure that out, I generally don't keep writing at that point. I put it aside. There's one essay I did about going through my mother's closets after she died and getting rid of all her clothes. And I wrote a draft of that maybe a year or two after she died, and then I could not finish that for 14 years because it didn't mean anything. Which seems like a weird thing. Your mother's died, of course that's important. But as a piece, I had no idea why I was writing it. Why would this be of any interest to anyone beyond pure sentiment? And it took me really 14 years to figure out why I was writing that and what it meant. And then I finished it. I wasn't thinking about it consistently for 14 years, but...
Crazy. I read that, I think, online, just looking at some of your work that was online.
Yeah, it was in South Loop Review, and I think they had it up on the website.
What did you find in the 14 years that did make it work?
I began to think about what clothes mean to us and how their costumes and how they are and are not related to who we feel we really are. How we think about, if you wear certain things, then you'll be that sort of person. And then there's the bits in there about clothes and fairy tales. So I think reading a lot of fairy tales, thinking about that, where it's really sort of clear cut. The princess whose father decides he's going to marry her escapes in a donkey skin. She's jettisoning her princess clothes and going in disguise in order to escape this father's wishes. And then when she is revealed to her prince as her true self, she's not really the servant dressed in a donkey skin, she's really a princess, the description of the clothes are so important. So I think reading fairy tales actually helped me figure out what was important about that for me.
You mentioned, I think, another nonfiction story. Is that something that you're working on more now than in the past?
Yes.
What drew you to start doing that?
Well, I started with that piece about my mother's closet where it felt, to begin with, that I needed to be really truthful. I wanted to honor that experience and honor her in as truthful a way as I could. I set out to write nonfiction. In going back over the drafts of that, I think this probably happens to everyone. It was like, really? Did that really happen, or did I make that up in a previous draft? So, well, I don't know how truthful some of the details are anymore, but that was the original intent. And then I had another piece of nonfiction that came out in Hotel America a couple of years ago that started because I wanted to explore a sentence that I loved and didn't come to understand until I could diagram it. And doing that writing began to link that experience of that sentence, which was about a poem, so then it began to be about the poem, the essay began to be about the poem as well, and linking it to real things in my life. But there's also a couple of sections in there that are fiction. then writing that made me think that I began to think just of a bunch of other topics I wanted to explore, and they're all about writers who have influenced me or have been important to me or whose work I loved, and then some sort of pairing of that book or story or writer with someone from my own family. So a sort of physical ancestors and literary ancestors. And I'm really just starting to work on those.
Is the writing different for you, fiction and nonfiction? Do you feel different ways about it?
The one thing that I guess I feel pretty strongly is that if I'm setting out to write nonfiction, to the best of my ability, I am not going to make stuff up in those sections. And the whole piece might be in a collage format in which there are sections in there that are clearly fiction. But if I'm saying, I took my daughter to South Dakota in 2010, and this is what happened, I'm not going to make stuff up and pretend that it happened. If I'm going to make stuff up, I'm going to say, now I'm making this up. That is a rule for me. Because if the real events are not supporting what I want the piece to mean, I just do it as fiction. That happened to me in one of the stories in the new collection, which is called On Seeing the Skeleton of a Whale in the Harvard Museum of Natural History, which is an amazing place if you ever get to go there. They have the skeleton of a sperm whale, and it's hanging from the ceiling. There's also a balcony, so that you can see the skeleton from below, but you can go up on the balcony and see it from above. And I was up on the balcony with my family and my in-laws and their kids, and looking down at the skeleton. And for some reason, maybe because I spent summers in Maine and read Moby Dick, I know quite a bit about whaling and sperm whales. So I could look down and I could see this thing, and it's like there is no room for a brain in that skeleton, which was really interesting to me. And at that time, my father had fairly recently had a stroke. I was like, wow, this is a great metaphor for what happened to my father. And I started trying to write this as nonfiction. It went nowhere. It was like, this is not interesting. To make it interesting, Dad has to be in the room. Dad has to be in the museum. But Dad was not in the museum. So I said, well, I want to just do this as fiction. And it created so many more possibilities, because Dad could be in the room. We could take actions with each other that illuminated the feelings in a much more concrete way. Like in the story, the main character, the woman, has a son. And in real life, my son and his grandfather, after his grandfather had the stroke, had this one moment of conflict. And it was not a big moment. My son said something under his breath. He was like 8 years old, and my father said something, right? So it was not particularly interesting moment of conflict. But in the story, I could have the child say something out loud, and I could have the grandfather stick out his cane and try and trip the kid, right? Mm-hmm. So and I had the woman abandon the father in the museum, which of course I never would have done in real life, right? You just don't do stuff like that. But fiction allows you to make your characters take much more extreme actions. And then that allows the sort of emotional content that you're aiming for to really be highlighted. So it really freed me up. And it eliminated, like I didn't have to have my husband in the story, or my daughter, or my in-laws, or my niece and nephew. None of them had to be in the story, or my mother-in-law, right? But in real life, they were all there, and I might have felt compelled to try and incorporate them if I were writing nonfiction. But it's like, no, I'm just doing this as fiction.